A year before Hillsborough, a Liverpool supporter wrote to the Football Association after an FA Cup semi-final at the Leppings Lane end. He said the crush was so severe that it was impossible to breathe, and that his umbrella had been snapped in half against a barrier. The FA's safety consultant later reported that the tie had gone well. 1 year later, in that same end, in those same central pens, the disaster would eventually claim 97 lives. This is the story of the Hillsborough disaster, not as an unforeseeable accident, but as a catastrophe with warnings, witnesses, and written evidence long before 15 April 1989. It is also the story of what happened after the crush, the cover-up, the smears, and a fight for truth that lasted more than 30 years. Hillsborough was Sheffield Wednesday's ground in Sheffield, and by 1989 its Leppings Lane end had been showing danger signs for years. The clearest early warning came in 1981 at another FA Cup semi-final. Serious congestion built outside the same Leppings Lane turnstiles. Gate C had to be opened to relieve pressure. On the West Terrace, fans were crushed badly enough that 38 people needed treatment, 8 went to hospital, and 3 had broken limbs. Fatalities were avoided, but only narrowly. After that match, South Yorkshire Police internally recognized that the terrace capacity was too high. Concerns were sent to Sheffield Wednesday. The club resisted the idea that the end was unsafe, with documents later showing cost was a major concern. Changes were made, but not the right ones. Radial fences divided the terrace into pens. In practice, they created narrow, enclosed sections that could overfill. But despite those structural changes, Hillsborough's safety certificate was never properly updated. The certificate still dated back to 1979. That mattered, because the numbers were wrong from the start. The West Terrace was still permitted to hold 7,200 people. Later expert analysis found the safe figure should have been no more than 4,518, and possibly as low as 3,089. Then came another decision that would matter in 1989. In 1986, a crush barrier near the tunnel entrance to the central pens was removed at police request to improve flow. Engineers raised concerns. Approval came with a condition: police would keep that area clear. There is no sign that conditions shaped the planning for the 1988 or 1989 semi-finals. The warnings kept coming. In 1987, another FA Cup semi-final at Hillsborough saw late-arriving supporters pile up outside Leppings Lane, badly enough that kick-off was delayed by 15 minutes. In 1988, Liverpool played Nottingham Forest in the semi-final at the same ground, with fans allocated to the same end they would use in 1989. Crushing developed again in the central pens. Police closed the tunnel to stop more supporters entering those pens. That simple, life-saving step was taken in 1988, and then never properly recorded in the debrief. A Liverpool supporter wrote to the FA after that match, describing a crush where breathing became impossible. The warning was explicit. It was written down, and it was ignored. The basic layout problems were just as clear. More than 24,000 supporters assigned to the Leppings Lane side were being funneled through only 23 turnstiles, with much higher passage rates than elsewhere in the ground. Then, 21 days before the 1989 semi-final, South Yorkshire Police replaced their experienced Hillsborough match commander, CH Supt Brian Mole, with CH Supt David Duckenfield, who had minimal experience of policing at the ground. No explanation for the change appears in the disclosed record. By the afternoon of 15th of April 1989, the warnings were no longer hidden. They were built into the stadium, the paperwork, the planning, and the memory of people who had already been crushed there. On Saturday, 15 April 1989, Liverpool and Nottingham Forest were due to kick off in an FA Cup semi-final at 3 p.m. Liverpool supporters were assigned the Leppings Lane end, the West Terrace standing area, the adjacent West Stand seating, and the North Stand. Nottingham Forest supporters were given the larger Spion Kop end. This allocation had problems before a single fan arrived. Liverpool had been given fewer tickets than Forest, despite comparable support, and more than 24,000 people on the Leppings Lane side were being served by just 23 turnstiles. Inside the ground, the central pens, numbers 3 and 4, sat directly ahead of a descending tunnel beneath the West Stand. The side pens were less obvious and harder to see from the concourse, so if no one redirected supporters, the crowd would naturally flow to the middle. By around 2:15, the build-up outside Leppings Lane was already serious. Superintendent Roger Marshall, the officer in charge outside, estimated 6,000 to 8,000 supporters in the area. People were spilling into the road. He radioed for Leppings Lane to be closed to traffic. The road closure was delayed. Inside the stadium, the imbalance was already visible. Pens 3 and 4 were filling faster than the side pens. At around 2:30, Duckenfield considered delaying kickoff, but decided not to. According to later findings, he used a very limited set of predetermined criteria, did not check turnstile counts, and did not properly assess conditions outside. By 2:40, the situation had become dangerous. Supporters outside described intense crushing. Some officers feared for their own safety. Horses were lifted by crowd pressure. Fans coming through the turnstiles were already distressed. At roughly the same time, BBC commentator John Motson noticed from above that the wing sections of the terrace were only just over half full, while the central area was tightly packed. A dangerous imbalance could be seen. At 2:47, Marshall radioed again, asking for exit gates to be opened to relieve pressure outside. He got no response. A brief opening of Gate C followed at about 2:48, letting in a relatively small number of supporters before it was shut again. Then, at 2:52 p.m., Gate C was opened again. More than 2,000 supporters entered over the next several minutes. What happened next is one of the most important facts in this story. There were no officers positioned on the inner concourse to direct those supporters away from the central tunnel, and no instruction was given to close the tunnel, leading straight down into pens 3 and 4, even though those pens were already dangerously full. Most people did what almost anyone would do in an unfamiliar, crowded stadium. They followed the most visible route. The tunnel sloped down toward the central pens, with standing above it, so the inflow kept moving into the middle. By 2:57, the pressure in pen 3 was so extreme that a perimeter gate at the front burst open. Officers on the track initially mistook what they were seeing for a pitch invasion and tried to push people back. At 3 p.m., the match kicked off. By then, the fatal crush was already underway. For the people trapped in pens 3 and 4, the next minutes were not chaos in the abstract. They were a physical collapse of space, air, and control. This part of the story needs restraint. The victims were not symbols. They were supporters who had gone to a football match and found themselves pinned inside fenced pens that could not safely absorb the crowd being funneled into them. As pressure built from the back, people at the front were forced against perimeter fencing and against each other. Many could not lift their arms. Many could not breathe. Some supporters in the side pens and on the track began trying to pull others over the fences. At 2:59, all the perimeter gates at the West Terrace were opened, and some officers started guiding people out. But by then, crucial minutes had already been lost. The match had started at 3 p.m. It was stopped at about 3:06, after players, officials, and people in the crowd realized this was not crowd disorder, but a mass casualty event. Supporters were brought onto the pitch. Advertising hoardings were torn down and used as makeshift stretchers. The emergency response then failed in ways that would haunt the families for decades. The South Yorkshire Ambulance Service did not promptly declare a major incident. Only one ambulance reached the pitch. Organized medical treatment was delayed while supporters themselves carried the injured and dying. For years, the original inquest treated 3:15 p.m. as a boundary, as if everything important had happened by then. But later medical review found that 41 victims had the potential to survive beyond that cutoff. The time limit had hidden a second layer of failure, not just how the crush happened, but how rescue broke down after it. 94 people died on 15th of April 1989 at the stadium or shortly after. Tony Bland died in 1993. Andrew Devine, who lived for 32 years with catastrophic brain injury caused by the crush, died in 2021 and was ruled the 97th victim. Most of those deaths were caused by compression asphyxia. None of them were caused by a drunken rampage, a ticketless invasion, or some spontaneous loss of control by Liverpool supporters. The disaster was created by overcrowding in a dangerous enclosure and by the failure to act when the danger was visible. What happened after Hillsborough is why the word cover-up cannot be dismissed as rhetoric. The documented record shows repeated attempts to deflect blame away from institutions and onto the dead and the survivors. On the afternoon of the disaster, Ch Supt David Duckenfield falsely told FA Chief Executive Graham Kelly and Sheffield Wednesday officials that Liverpool fans had forced open Gate C. That was untrue. It was corrected later that evening by Chief Constable Peter Wright, but by then the false story was already in circulation. Over the next few days, that false version hardened into a smear. On 19th of April 1989, The Sun published its notorious front-page headline, The Truth, repeating false allegations that Liverpool fans had pickpocketed victims, urinated on police, and attacked an officer giving the kiss of life. Those claims were baseless. The Hillsborough Independent Panel later found there was little or no evidence for them. The same pattern ran through official paperwork. After the disaster, South Yorkshire police officers were asked to write accounts that were then reviewed and altered. The most recent finding is that 327 police accounts were amended. The Hillsborough Independent Panel had earlier found 164 substantive alterations, with 116 changed to remove or dilute comments unfavourable to South Yorkshire Police. The edits followed a pattern. References to chaos, panic, fear, and confusion disappeared. Criticisms of senior leadership were removed. Mentions of previous semi-finals, of monitoring pen capacity, and of closing the tunnel in 1988 were stripped out. Officers were even told in writing that no criticisms should be leveled at anyone and that there should be no mention of the word chaotic. The ambulance service changed statements too. So did the broader public narrative. While families were identifying loved ones and survivors were trying to process what they had witnessed, police checks were being run on the dead to impugn their reputations, and blood alcohol levels were taken from all of the deceased, including children, with no rational justification. Then came the first inquest. In 1991, South Yorkshire coroner Dr. Stephen Popper imposed a 3:15 p.m. cutoff, meaning the jury would hear no evidence about what happened after that time. The verdict was accidental death by a majority of 9-2. Families had already spent 2 years being blamed for a disaster they knew had not been caused by the crowd. Now the legal process had locked that story in place. But the families did not stop. For more than 2 decades they kept pushing, through failed reviews, public campaigns, journalism, and political pressure. In 1997, the alteration of police statements became public. In 2009, a call for full disclosure at a memorial service helped force the issue back into national politics. In 2010, the Hillsborough Independent Panel was established under Bishop James Jones. When the panel reported in September 2012, after examining around 400,000 documents, it changed the public record. It concluded that the disaster had been foreseeable. It found strenuous attempts by police to deflect blame onto supporters. It found no evidence of exceptional drunkenness, no evidence of large numbers of ticketless fans, and no basis for the smears that had defined the early coverage. It found that 41 victims had the potential to survive beyond 3:15 p.m. And it showed in document after document how the institutional story had been managed. Prime Minister David Cameron responded in Parliament with an apology for what he called a double injustice. The old verdicts were quashed. New inquests began in 2014 and sat for 279 days. On 26th of April 2016, the jury returned one of the most important findings in modern British legal history. The 96 victims then recognized in law were unlawfully killed. The jury also rejected claims that Liverpool supporters had contributed to the dangerous situation. That matters, and so does the legal distinction that followed. The 2016 inquest found Duckenfield responsible for manslaughter by gross negligence as part of its conclusions. But in criminal proceedings, he was later acquitted of gross negligence manslaughter at retrial in 2019 after an earlier jury failed to reach a verdict. No one has been criminally convicted over the disaster or the cover-up. So the history of Hillsborough is not only that 97 people died. It is that for 27 years before the unlawful killing verdicts, many of the bereaved had to fight not just grief, but an official lie. They had to prove that the people who died were not the authors of their own deaths. The record now shows what they said from the beginning. The disaster was foreseeable, the blame was falsely shifted, and the truth was delayed for decades. The disaster changed British stadium safety because it made certain excuses impossible to defend. Lord Justice Peter Taylor's interim report, published in August 1989, did not blame the dead, the survivors, or some mythical loss of crowd discipline. It said plainly that the main reason for the disaster was the failure of police control. It criticized the failure to close the central tunnel after Gate C was opened as a blunder of the first magnitude. And it identified the wider system failures around the bottleneck, the pens, the removed barrier, the inadequate safety certificate, and the absence of contingency planning. Taylor's final report, published in January 1990, turned those findings into a blueprint for reform. Its most famous recommendation was that major football grounds should move to all-seater accommodation. Taylor argued that seating improved both safety and crowd control more than any other single measure. That recommendation reshaped the game. Through the Football Spectators Act 1989 and the licensing system that followed, all-seater requirements were imposed on designated grounds. The Football Licensing Authority was established to oversee safety certification. Perimeter fencing of the kind that had trapped supporters at Hillsborough was removed from English football grounds. Training, stewarding, communication, and crowd management standards were tightened across the sport. Not every recommendation was universally applied forever, and not every problem in football disappeared. But one deadly configuration did. The caged standing terrace, fed by bottlenecks, divided by rigid pens, and managed with guesswork instead of real-time control, became indefensible after Hillsborough. That is the pattern this channel keeps returning to. Safety rules are rarely born from imagination. They are written in blood, usually after somebody saw the danger first and was ignored. At Hillsborough, the warning signs were everywhere. In the 1981 crush, in the flawed paperwork, in the removed barrier, in the 1987 delay, in the 1988 tunnel closure, and in the letter from a supporter who said it had been impossible to breathe. On 15th of April 1989, those warnings became a disaster that would eventually claim 97 lives. And the reason the number is now 97 matters too. For more than 30 years, the dead were remembered as the 96. Then, in 2021, Andrew Devine was ruled the 97th victim, a final reminder that Hillsborough was not a moment that ended when the match stopped. The rules changed because people died. The truth changed because families refused to let a lie stand. And the warning had been there before the disaster began.